my lecture this morning, the Freedom of Information Act of 2011, as it confronts the immense challenge of what I call the dictatorship of corruption and mediocrity, is a very small part of this global issue of the centrality of a free press and independent-minded journalism for all modern democratic societies. But this should not blind us, this smallness should not blind us to the immensity of its ramifications for the survival of our country and the future prospects of the majority of our people. Since the term dictatorship of corruption and mediocrity, the title of my talk, goes to the heart of this assertion, let me now dispel any puzzlement concerning the term by directly addressing the range of issues and significations I have in mind in my use of it. But before going directly to this theme, a word of clarification is perhaps necessary. Drives all my observations, analysis, and projections is this: what need do we, the dictatorship of corruption and mediocrity in our country is so open about our country. Let me put this even more concrete. Corruption, official banditry operates in our country, not in secrecy, but we still need that landmark legislation that is known as the Freedom of Information Act that was passed in the year 2011. Even if corruption and the mediocrity which it creates on a vast scale in our country are normatively not hidden, not shrouded in secrecy. As a matter of fact, I shall in the course of my lecture be arguing that there is a crisis of underutilization of the Freedom of Information Act by our press, by our media houses, in spite of the fact that they were at the forefront of the struggle, of the long struggle for the passing of the Act. Indeed, my central argument in the lecture will be that though the nature and scale of corruption in Nigeria poses a challenge to the Freedom of Information Act, this is a challenge that is not insurmountable. Before I come to this argument, it is perhaps helpful to highlight three particular cases that are exemplary in their graphic illustration of the climate of corruption that the FOI must contend with in our country, that is almost without comparison with the moral and political climates that the Freedom of Information Act in other countries of the world have to deal with. And I say parenthetically, let me note here that the Freedom of Information Act exists in many countries of the world. It has indeed become an almost indispensable part of human and civil rights legislation in many parts of the world. Now, the first case concerns perhaps the biggest and the most brazen act of state or official corruption ever perpetrated in Nigeria itself, or perhaps in any other country in the world for that matter. This sublime brigandage is known as the oil subsidy scam of 2011. It involved vast sums of money paid out of our national coffers to a cabal of oil marketers that holds the lifeline to the distribution of petroleum products in our country. I am sure that every woman and man in this hall has heard already. For the avoidance of doubt or confusion, let us remember that in the Nigerian country allocation to defray the cost of refined oil imported into the country of petroleum products that the nation consumes annually. There is a long-standing controversy. The important thing to note here is that in the year 2011, and depending on which set of posted and announced figures you use for your computation, what was actually paid out to marketers as petroleum products sold and consumed in the country. Specifically, in the 5 years, sum paid out for oil subsidy by the federal government had been around 400 billion naira. Indeed, sum of 1.3 trillion had been paid out to the marketers. I say alleged here because 1.3 trillion was only one of the figures thrown around. On this particular critical issue, let me quote from the report of an ad hoc committee of the House of Representatives on that oil subsidy scam, and I quote, "Contrary to the earlier official figure of subsidy payment of 1.3 trillion, the Accountant General of the Federation put forward a figure of 1.6 trillion, the Central Bank 1.7 trillion, while our committee established subsidy payment of 2.58 trillion as of December 2011, amounting to more than 900% over the appropriated sum of 2.5 billion. Let me add a small note of clarification on the particular finding of this House of Representatives ad hoc committee that the sum of 2.5 trillion naira actually paid out was 900% greater than the 2.5 billion naira budgeted. For the year 2011, the budget approved for the whole country was 4.97 trillion, which means that what was paid out to the cabal of oil marketers was more than half of the national budget for the entire country. And to place this within the framework of some of the convertible currencies of the world, 2.58 trillion naira is approximately 16 billion US dollars, which were never supplied. One more quotation from that same House of ad hoc committee report I am calling the Dictatorship of Corruption and Mediocrity. This is the quotation. Scheme mandating agencies in industry to keep reliable information databases to the decadence and the rot that the committee found in the administration of the PSF. We found out that the subsidy regime as operated under review, that is 2000, in the period under review, was fraught with endemic corruption and entrenched inefficiency. Much of the amount claimed to have been paid as due mainly to sleaze and in many cases, incompetence. Decadence, rot, entrenched inefficiency, incompetence. These are the committee's own terms, not mine. Mine is only to draw a conclusion from these terms and to make extrapolations from the combined effect of their constellation in the report's searing indictment of the sublime kind of corruption that reigns in our country. And this is my conclusion, my extrapolation. Corruption is not only dishonesty, fraud, or sleaze. It is also aided by and in turn generates mediocrity, rottenness, and putrefaction. We shall come back to this issue later in the lecture. For now, let us turn our attention to the second of the three exemplary cases that I wish to highlight in this observation and reflections. To loot and divert vast sums from the PDF to the benefit of himself and his foreign co-conspirators. Please note that the word loot was in the report that Festour sent to the National Assembly with a demand that impeachment proceedings be launched against the Vice President. Of course, as could be expected, Atiku promptly responded to Festour's charges. But what no one expected, what in fact nearly took everyone's breath away in Atiku's response, was that he did not deny the charges at all. Rather than a denial, he alleged that Festour and some of his cronies and girlfriends had benefited from the funds he had diverted from the PTBF. And to back up this claim, Atiku made photocopies of the checks he had written in favor of these cronies and paramours of Obasanjo. He took out full-page advertorial spreads in major newspapers in which documents in support of this extraordinary counter-accusation were published. Indeed, for several weeks, Nigerian newspapers were filled with lurid details of the looting activities of the president and the vice president, all put out by the Obasanjo and Atiku camps. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it is tempting to say that this story speaks for itself, but that is not exactly true. To the story itself, and for our purposes in this lecture, we must add that no action based on the FOI, that is the Freedom of Information Act, could ever have brought out the surfeit of information on the looting, the corruption that Obasanjo and Atiku, together with their supporters, voluntarily revealed about themselves. And let us note that nothing happened to Obasanjo, Atiku, and their cronies, girlfriends, and sycophants that benefited from the vast looting of the funds of the PDTDF by way of well-deserved punitive actions. Indeed, ironically, the only person, the single person who did go to jail was the American congressman, William J. Jefferson, who at one time was Atiku's point man in the United States Theater of Operations in financial wheeling and dealing before he and the vice president quarreled and went their separate ways. But Jefferson served prison time in the United States, not in Nigeria. And he did so only because the FBI got involved in investigating the scandal. And when they raided his Washington, D.C. home, they found $100,000 hidden in the congressman's refrigerator. The country, an eruption whose end seemed at the time to be nowhere in the horizon. The case in point is the Buhari-Idiagbon Decree number 4 of 1984, unquestionably the most notorious of all military decrees ever promulgated in Nigeria. That decree has a special bearing on the subject of this lecture, a bearing that is the exact opposite of what I have said so far concerning the challenge of the dictatorship of corruption and mediocrity to the Freedom of Information Act. For on one level, this is because in military rule, dictatorship manifests itself directly and autocratically. It does not have to manifest itself through corruption. At another level, you simply cannot talk of a Freedom of Information Act in the Nigerian and African dictatorships of the 1970s through the 1990s, when the very first thing that goes with the inception of a military dictatorship is the Constitution itself, together with all the rights that derive from it. Moreover, Nigerian and African military dictatorships are notoriously very paranoid to the extent that many African military dictators at the time actually went so far as to promulgate decrees banning rumors, as if any human society has ever existed in which there can be no rumor mongering as an inevitable part of social existence. At any rate, the Buhari-Idiagbon Decree number 4 of 1984 took this axiomatic and quixotic paranoia of African military dictatorships to a new level when it explicitly stated that you must not and cannot publish anything to embarrass military leaders and their support civilian officials, even if what you publish is true.